evening, all. I'm Rick Traynor. I'm the newly installed warden of Rhodes House and chief executive of the Rhodes Trust, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all here this evening, whether you're here for the first time or the first time in a long time, or among the many people who are regular visitors and regulars more generally of Rhodes House. Hosting discussion events like the one we're about to have this evening is an important part of how we try to use Rhodes House to encourage dialogue and learning. And in this particular event, we're delighted to be collaborating with the World Reimagined once again, following the inaugural joint panel discussion and joint art exhibition that were held in 2023. I look forward very much, as I'm sure you all do, to hearing the contributions of our panelists this evening on the important topics that are being explored and to learning from their diverse voices and experiences. And of course, also hearing from you, the audience. I'd now like to hand over to Dr. Michelle Gale, head and co-founder of the World Reimagined, to say a few words. Michelle, please welcome her.
Thank you very much for joining us this evening. The World Reimagined, we believe passionately in inciting conversations about Britain's historical past, conversations that are sometimes quite challenging, but conversations that we believe need to be had. We don't believe in finger pointing. We believe in sharing ideas, sharing the truth, and being honest to encourage empathy as well as understanding. We only work with organizations that are willing to do the work. Organizations that, for us, embody the 3 A's. The 3 A's for the World Reimagined are acknowledgement, accountability, followed by action. So a lot of organizations out there may acknowledge stuff, tick the box, and carry on with the rest of their lives. The reason we work with the Rhodes Trust is because they act. They make sure that they don't just say, they do. It's really an honor to be here for a second year, hopefully at the second of many more talks to come. And now I'd like to introduce you to somebody who was Mayor of Bristol from 2016 until 2024. Some of the achievements there were thousands of affordable housing built under his watch, making sure that Bristol became a leading voice in the Mayor's Migration Council and ensuring dignity for all migrants. And also his work in sustainability, which is why we've called upon Marvin today. Marvin has made Bristol, was it 2030? Bristol will be a zero carbon city because of the initiatives that Marvin has taken. Recently made a Lord. Please welcome Marvin Rees.
I've got one here. All right, so thank you and welcome. And I appreciated what you had to say at the beginning. If I just reflect on my own experiences as mayor, when I was elected, I was the first person of Black African heritage in Europe to be elected mayor of a city. And that had dynamics to it for my time in office, not least how we grappled in Bristol with our history of one of the biggest slave ports, along with Liverpool, Hull, and London. And I'm of mixed heritage as well. My great-grandmother's from Ireland, my granddad's from Merthyr Tydfil, my mum born in Bristol. And we held all that together in the city. But when we were talking about our history, one of the points I'd often make is this is just about trying to understand who we are and how we got here. As you said, it's not about finger pointing, anything like that. Just about identifying data, grappling with it, and sometimes that data will cause us to have new conclusions. Not changing history is the debate. It just means we review what we thought we knew about ourselves and how we got here because we've got new information, or we understand the information that we previously think we've misunderstood, and maybe not. But that's, to me, what today is about, just having that discussion. So we are going to look at the relationships, and I say that plural, between the climate emergency, colonialism, and racism. If those relationships are actually there, and I want to put that in because we are having a discussion. And if they are there, some of the things we might touch on with the panel discussion and our discussion with you today are the parts that those relationships have had in the development and the compounding of the climate emergency that we're facing right now. There is a question of responsibility, because that has consequences for what we do with global finance, investment, and development today. There were questions of differential levels of vulnerability to the consequences of climate change. And in my city, as we were looking at this whole idea of a just transition, which is a very important idea as well, we would often grapple with the fact that there's a perversity in climate change, in that my sense, to be tested, is that it's the poorest and most vulnerable who get hit first and hardest by the consequences of climate change, but they are also most vulnerable to being negatively impacted by the economic restructuring that some people say we have to go through to avoid compounding that emergency. It's been a big issue in some of our communities within Bristol and globally. And then how does it impact on our individual, our community, our city, our national abilities to adapt and mitigate? And importantly, what I hope goes through the discussions for the whole of today as well is what's next. Now, that doesn't mean you have to have a piece of paper and you put the solution for COP later this year written on that. But there's a sense of movement. And it would be great if by the time we get to the end of our discussion today, if some people will be willing, and I'll ask the panel to share as well, is there a new thought, a new insight, a new perspective, a development of an existing thought that you previously held that has come about as a result of this conversation today? Or even if it hasn't, just a new challenge or a new question that you're going to be grappling with, and that would be great to have a sense of movement. So I would ask you to keep your contributions to the point, to really dive into the panelists, tackle the points, they raise them, push back, ask them to expand, and most of obviously to have a fulfilling, enjoyable evening. So let me introduce our panelists for today. The first, I'm going to start with the screen, the robot on the end, as was described to me, the machine. So Dorah Marema is the portfolio head for municipal sustainability at the South African Local Government Association, leading the work to support municipalities in South Africa on issues of environmental management, climate change, disaster management, and fire services. And she's a senior Atlantic Fellow for Racial Equity. Paul Gardullo is just on the edge here, is a curator and assistant director of history at the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, where he also directs the Center for the Study of Global Slavery. The center focuses on large international collaborations that help connect this past to our present. Next along, we have Tori Harwell, who's a Rhodes Scholar in residence from Denver, Colorado, elected out of Missouri. And Tori continues to work with farmers around the world, and she strives to highlight farmers' contributions to global climate resilience. And Wawa Gatheru is a Gen Z climate activist and Rhodes Scholar, passionate about cultivating a climate movement that is made in the image of all of us. And she is the founder and executive director of Black Girl Environmentalist, the only national organization dedicated to addressing the pipeline and pathway issue for black girls, women, and gender-expansive individuals in the climate sector. So could we welcome our panel, please? So I'm asking everyone to be tight today, but I'm going to start with the panel. So I hope you did get the note. I was going to ask you to share an initial reaction to the title today on climate emergency, colonialism, and racism. So Dorah, can I ask for your initial provocation for the room in response to this title? What would you have us grapple with this evening?
No, thank you very much, and apologies that I cannot be there in person. But I am really, really deeply grateful for this opportunity. For me, this is a topic that is very close to my heart as I participate very closely in the international climate negotiations, as well as really making sure that the sub-regional governments are involved in these negotiations. And I've also worked over 20 years in civil society, looking at how grassroots communities are impacted, but again, how their voice can be able to be brought into this topic. For me, one of the most important things is to finally realize that we have to start looking into the root causes of racialism and climate injustice, that the two are intrinsically linked. A lot of research and the work that has been done by a lot of environmental activists have really started to prove that there is a very clear link, and there is also recognition that I think you already talked about the marginalized communities that continue to bear the brunt, but we haven't really looked deeply into the structural causes of this vulnerability. We need to recognize that the global North's developed status is really very linked into not only their how they define themselves, but also in terms of what it is to be developed, but also their shared colonial past. And I think on the other end, when you look at those who are the countries that are bearing the brand, many of them were colonized. I think by 2008, we started to see the change. But the impact of that structural racism and colonialism really still, is still what defines the vulnerability of many of the countries in the global South, including even within the global North, when we look at those people that are impacted. So we need to look deep into ways in which colonialism and racism have shaped the climate change policy internationally. When you look at the outcomes of COP29 that was held in Baku, you probably already know that there isn't a lot of movement when it comes to climate finance, but also in terms of the commitment to be able to reduce carbon emissions. There isn't movement there. And I think it's telling that a lot of those countries that have colonized a lot of countries that are that have colonized a lot of the nations that are struggling still lead the climate change regime in terms of provision of finance. They determine the rules of engagement, and if we are not going to look at how colonialism and racism have enabled climate change, the reason why we are here, the fact that we are now know that there's a lot of countries that have developed at the expense of many. If we are not going to look at how colonialism and racism have shaped the climate change policy and the action or inaction that we are currently facing. I mean, right now, a lot of us have lost faith in the international climate regime because it feels that, we feel that there really must be another way of dealing with these issues. And again, how racialized communities are continuously being displaced and impacted by climate change in the context of all of this. We are not going to be able to solve this problem. So it is important for us to realize that there can never be climate justice without racial justice.
Right.
That
what I'm going to ask is, because we got a lot there, I think there's one of the things I'd like to reflect on with you and all the audience as well is how we make sure that, and I don't want to prejudice the discussion of it, well, I think a very strong case for a legitimate conversation around structural racism and the climate emergency doesn't then become turned into an accusation of dwelling in the past when the crisis is of the moment, right? Because I think that's one of the dangers, that's one of the tightrope we have to navigate in making that case. So I would welcome your reflections on that we stay with that discussion unlocks the conversation of the moment and how we make sure that happens. So we can come to that as the conversation continues, one of our provocations. Can I come to you now, Paul? Your initial provocation for the discussion. You can build on any of that or come with something.
Thank you, Marvin, and thank you all. I feel a little like an interloper. I don't have a connection to Rhodes. I'm a historian from New Jersey. And but I think I'm really glad. I feel like I'm also an interloper, but maybe not, because I want to talk about history. And I want to build off of what you were just asking. We are in a moment of crisis, right? With these questions of the environment and their impact, with questions of racism in our world. We're also in a crisis, I would argue, of historical amnesia. And we're seeing it. We're seeing a sense of a lack of true engagement with some of the questions that Dorah herself and the issues that she was raising. I think that some of the crises that we're talking about that have to do with the lack of biodiversity, right? Existing and expanding climate change, and the way in which it is disproportionately being borne by marginalized communities, communities of people who were formerly colonized or enslaved, is a structural result of these twinned legacies of colonialism and transatlantic or transoceanic slavery, right? And I think that we need to look at some of the structures that those systems created. The plantation model, right? Extractive mining. Systems that twinned the exploitation of people with the exploitation of the environment, right? This is the history that Marvin, you were bringing up, it's about collecting the facts, right? It's about amassing trusted knowledge, sometimes in conversation, in debate, and then taking that forward. We have a responsibility to think about, when we think about the creation of our world, we need to think about the structures that helped give birth to it, that reach back 400 years. Not in overly simplistic ways, but acknowledging the complexity of that past. I would argue that it's also not just about acknowledging the pain of that past. We need to acknowledge that past and talk about it in its fullness. For me, and this is what I would suggest as maybe a provocation, is to that history of exploitation, we have another lineage to reclaim and reconnect with. And this is a lineage, and I'll call it an alternative lineage of freedom making by those people who were colonized, by those people who were enslaved and their descendants. The way in which they engaged with, in the case of our conversation tonight, the natural world, to create alternative landscapes, sometimes sacred, mostly in secret, right? That had to do with creating spaces of solace and refuge, but also places of productivity. And places, what I'll call it is an alternative green landscape. There is a history there that is waiting for us to tap into, understand, and use as a wellspring for our own crisis today. This is why the past matters.
And I think as you talk about that amnesia, one of the things for us to reflect on is why. Why is there this amnesia? Is it accidental? Is it a lack of critical thinking? Is Is it conscious? Is it intentional? Maybe we can have this floating around in the past as you make the point. It's important to us to understand today. Why would we lose that, and what do we do about that? Tori, your provocation.
Yeah, so I think I often experience conversations about climate change as these like disaster narratives, right? Like this is the end of a world, this is an apocalypse, right? But I think there's also value in viewing also transatlantic slavery and colonization as apocalypses that have happened before us. And so there's real knowledge to be learned from people who have lived through these apocalypses. And I think there's a deep knowing of, yeah, our world is ending, and yet we can still live on. And so I think that's something that I want to touch on in this conversation of there's knowledge to be had from people who have gone through very similar moments that feel impossible to live through, right? And then on top of that, I think also we often reimagine the past in the current as well. And there's structurally, we've built up legacies that we still live through and shape every day. And something that I think I want to also chat about in this conversation is, for example, a lot of our understanding of the green revolution that's happening right now is very deeply tied into like lithium batteries and cobalt mining. And those legacies are still in the DRC, where rubber mining for cars first took place, right? So these aren't legacies that are divorced from each other. They are shaping the modern and like current narratives that are happening right now as well. And so I think to relegate them to the past is also a disservice. And I think that it could actually be a very interesting moment in looking at the dreams of the past and how they turn into the legacies of right now.
And I think too, one of the points you make, how we get those voices heard. So those historic achievements and leadership and that wisdom being at the center table, shaping our planet now, that is one of our challenges, which actually feeds over into your Gen Z representation as well. So your initial provocation, it was in your bio. So.
Embarrassing. Well, I'm Gen Z, y'all. Contested. I'm a 98 baby, so it depends on who you ask. Also, great to be back. I mean, I'm really delighted to be a part of this conversation and to hear from everyone. I think what I'd like to talk about is how the climate crisis is a poly crisis, right? We obviously are experiencing this age of ecological breakdown. We're seeing it every single day, it seems as though. 2024 was the hottest recorded year in recorded history, and the only year that was hotter was 2023, before 2024 happened. We're in the midst of all this devastation, but the climate crisis is also a narrative crisis. It's a narrative crisis because there is this fundamental historical amnesia that the climate community experiences when we talk about things like colonization, even race. We experience something called existential exceptionalism, which is where folks in the climate community sometimes see talking about race as an add-on or perhaps a disservice to the real issues of ecological breakdown. But also, we're in the midst of a leadership crisis, and that's a lot of the work that I do with my nonprofit, Black Girl Environmentalist. The reality is that you have racialized people around the world, and my work is really grounded in the U.S., where people of color have been disproportionately impacted by the climate crisis, by the systems that have created it, and unfortunately are not receiving any of the benefits when it comes to all of this investment going into a so-called just transition. And I think that it is a disservice to even use the term of just transition without having tangible conversations about how this transfer of wealth should or should not be recreating the systems that have led us here, and making sure that it is racialized people, people of color, Black folks who are involved in climate solutions, as well as being able to have the agency to define what an environmental solution is.
Some very powerful points. It puts me in mind of one of the challenges I heard levied at some of the environmental groups, to quote Dave Chappelle, believing that you're right gets you drunk, and people get drunk on their sense of being right, fail to have any sense of self-reflection. And sort of this point about race being an add-on to environmentalism is a massive issue, as even in their own structures, recreating the very hierarchies that have historically led to what we are today. So let me make space for you as a panel now to pick up on each other's points and develop those, as you wish. But if I can just throw one in myself. Dorah, just on the structural racism, it might be helpful just to get a bit of a concise definition of what we mean by that, because I think sometimes when we talk about racism, sometimes people think it's about saying mean words to each other, and I think there's a lot more to it than that, questions of power. But how would you define structural racism as landing in the world, as manifest, as operating?
I am here in South Africa, and I can tell you so many examples. I can pick up an example of a bank. Banks in South Africa that we rely so much on in terms of accessing funding for all kind of things right now. For me to be able to access modern energy services and water services, to have decent housing and all the likes. If you stay if you stay in a township, for example, where I am in Johannesburg, in Soweto, and you go to a bank and you are a young, Black South African asking for a loan for you to be able to buy a house, right? Automatically you are profiled. So there is that inherent what can I say, disadvantage in terms of you being, coming from that community that is 100% Black, many people, not able to earn a living, that you are not going to be able to qualify to be able to get a mortgage for your house, for example. So there are, and a lot of those, they still exist within a lot of structures. And even though it's post apartheid in South Africa, a lot of institutions still racially profile a lot of South Africans, just as an example. And we see this play a lot within the global climate regime, where the developed countries are the ones that then are able to shape the kind of climate finance that can be attached to, for example, to various climate mitigation, adaptation responses. That a lot of the funding that is even made available is actually loans rather than grants. And I think it's a lot of these colonialists continue to shape how we are going to respond to climate change and how climate change is being financed. And I think that we are missing something if we are not going to look deeper into why are even these things allowed to be able to happen. Because what it does is that it leaves few people in charge of how the world is going to be able to respond and at what pace. There's issues around intellectual properties, and those, it's really very complicated. And I think it also undermines and it boxes many of the communities that are vulnerable into just victims and not those that can really play a very meaningful role in terms of solving this issue of climate crisis. And if we are not going to be able to resurface these issues and say, how can we be able to transform the way that we are responding as the world, to be able to make sure that those that are affected are able to be afforded an opportunity to be able to come up with solutions that work for them, because we shouldn't be relying on the global north to be able to provide us with solutions in terms of how we could be able to respond. because historically we have our own knowledge. So it manifests in many forms, and I think we can describe it in terms of where we are in the world. I describe it in terms of where I am here, in terms of how it manifests on a day-to-day basis.
And that reaches, sorry, Paul.
No, go ahead.
No, you go ahead. It's better to hear from you than me.
Oh, I was just thinking about what Dorah was saying, and thinking about some examples, right? And I think Tori gave a very good example of the way that structural racism is happening, and also the structure of profit making when she talked about the mining in what is now the DRC, was once the Belgian Congo, right? And the way in which extractive practices of rubber extraction are now around lithium. Another example, perhaps closer to home, is coming from America, where 6 out of every 10 incarcerated people is Black. That is not unusual when we're looking at other populations, same in Brazil. For instance, maybe even a higher percentage. And we think about the control and policing of Black bodies and the way in which that is structured over time. I think to a very specific example that is close to here in Great Britain is we've done some work on a company, one of the largest companies of restraint producers in world history. Is a company that was born in Birmingham, Hyatt and Company, and they made shackles that were used throughout the slave trade on at least 3 continents. They made shackles that were used throughout the Great Britain's colonial project. They are also, although they are now owned by an American company, they were sold in, I think, the early 2000s, but they are one of the main handcuff producers in the world, right? So speed cuffs that are used every day by police departments are made by Hyatt and Company. There's a structural relationship. There's a profit-making relationship with deep impact there. These are the histories that we need to begin to know. In Birmingham, in the 20th century, many of the people who were employed by Hyatt were of the Windrush generation, right? They were immigrants to this nation who were both making the products that they were then targeted and incarcerated around, not for their work, but because of the color of their skin, right? I think those kind of examples are the ways that we can begin to open up a conversation around this history and the way it's enacted and impacts us today.
So what do we do with that history? Is it? Can you, between you, describe to me the connection between understanding that history and unlocking concrete action on climate change, climate injustice, different levels of vulnerability? Is it just something that we should be aware of, or describe to me why it is a necessary step, body of knowledge to work through to take us to a healthy, more impactful, effective intervention on this this one crisis among polycrises?
I mean, the green landscape. Is this on? Is it on? Yes. No. It is green. Yeah. Well, I guess I'll just. Oh, here it is. I mean, when we look at the environmental movement and where funding goes, we understand that conceptions of nature actually have a very racist history. And it is important to acknowledge that because it informs who gets the money now and what environments are worth protecting and whom. So if we go back to the foundation of the American conservation movement, which in many ways has informed the global environmental movements that we look to today, it was created by the founding fathers, who were all white supremacists: Aldo Leopold, Madison Grant, John Muir, the founder of the Sierra Club, who quite literally created and crafted this language of conservation to accommodate very racialized definitions of nature and to protect the white race, right? Or the so-called white race, as they were calling it. And so when we think about the environmental movement today, them not acknowledging that history is actually a huge problem, right? And I always go back to how climate communication in the environmental space really needs a communication facelift from a historical point of view, but because those conceptions of nature actually underpin terminology that we use as academics, as students, as practitioners. The term, the Anthropocene, is one that was popularized in the 1980s. And there are so many people, including myself, that push back on that term. The Anthropocene is not a term that really encompasses the systems that have led us to the ecological age we're in, right? The Anthropocene flattens the human. It doesn't talk about the institutions that have led us here, the fossil fuel industry. A term that's actually probably better suited is the Plantationocene, where we talk about the system of racial capitalism that have led us to the climate crisis and the transformation of nature via the colonization of people and the colonial plantation itself. So we have to talk about those histories in order to get to a place to have the conversation of where solutions go.
I think also it's determined who we're willing to sacrifice, right, in this current moment, right? So much of the conversation is about communities that can actually, like, who are sacrificed in these natural disasters, which I wouldn't actually call natural. We've made them over time. And so, like, for example, I want to take one that's actually quite pertinent, is the LA fires, and actually connect it back to enslavement and the mass prison industrial complex in the US. People who are fighting the fires currently are are imprisoned people in the US. And so they also aren't paid a lot per day. And to fight this natural disaster, which also was in part created because we disrupted indigenous fire regimes in Southern California. This claving out of property has created these moments where we can no longer have fire regimes that were important to those areas. And I think that's also connected back into a lot of these conversations that we've already been having. And I think it's important to see who is at the front lines of fighting natural disasters and what communities are being sacrificed. It could be dated back to Katrina. There's many, many different examples that we could unpick. But I think it's important that that be a central part of the conversation, that it's not just nature that will face the consequences. It will be the people who have been racialized as well.
I think one of the big challenges that comes out there, going back to a point made earlier on, is the very nature of the voice that's being heard. I mean, what you shared is a huge challenge to the environmental movement that hasn't always wanted to deal with, right? Because they're the good people, right? They're standing up for the world, standing up for what's right, and the challenge that there potentially is something in the very nature of that movement that also needs to look at, that if it is not, will leave it less well prepared to tackle the big global systems around us is a huge challenge, feedback. It makes it very, very complicated. Paul, going back to your point on this historical amnesia, what do we do about that?
I think we need to acknowledge it in the institutions where we work. I work at the National Museum of African American History and Culture in the United States. That isn't a museum that existed 20 years ago. That is a museum that was being called for by Black activists since 1915, right? The families of American Civil War veterans saw a landscape around them in the early 20th century that was being built, a landscape of memory that all of us, if you look at the news of Washington, D.C., you see today. You see the U.S. National Mall with its monuments and memorials. That is not a natural landscape. That is a created landscape. It's a landscape primarily created in the 20th century. It's a highly symbolic landscape as well. One that at that time had a lot to do with a professed reconciliation, right? Reconciliation between white Northerners in the U.S. context and Southerners, people who tried to destroy the nation versus people who tried to preserve the nation, at the expense of the memory of African Americans, right? Who not only attempted to preserve the nation but transform it to embrace a fuller sense of freedom, right? A fuller sense of freedom that is embodied in the U.S. Constitution and its amendments that are currently being questioned. I'm sorry. This is what it means to kind of engage, and so this call for an institution, a museum, a memorial, to pay tribute to people who were in a project to rescue a nation that they saw as being that was occluding and suppressing them is a powerful, powerful thing. It took 100 years to realize. Now there's an institution that is built with community voices at the center of it, right? That with rigorous scholarship that can be a convening place, both locally, nationally, and internationally, for these kinds of conversations, right? It's birthing. Has attracted a massive audience that never existed before. Over 10 million people have visited the museum in its first 8 years. The majority of whom are people of color, right? Many of whom are young people expressing the fact that we haven't heard this history anywhere else, right? This is an essential history. This is a history for all people, by the way. It's not for some, it's for all. I think this is, and the lessons imparted there, ones of dialogue, ones of truth-telling, ones of, facing history, good, the bad, and the ugly, is vital to our conversations. Museums are one place for it, a very public place of public education, but universities are another site. And we need to really be thinking and be about the business of democratizing knowledge in a fuller sense of that word. And let me just stop there, because I'll continue to go on. But I think this question of what can we do from the place where we're at, I think seems to be vital, seems to me to be vital for all of us, wherever we sit.
So I'm going to come to you in just a couple of minutes, but I'm just going to, just to finalize this part of the discussion, I'm just going to ask you this question. We have COP later this year. Off the back of the last COP, there was a public letter written saying the process is failing. We're on course to, 2.9? It said the COP process has been great at producing policy frameworks, metrics, but not good at driving practical delivery of the interventions and that are needed, and those must be decarbonisation, the rollout of technology, and so forth, but also support for populations to go through the transition, as well. But so we're leading up to Brazil in November. Before that, we have New York Climate Week in September. We'll have London Climate Week in, when's that, May, June. We've got networks like C40, cities around the world, and I'm particularly thinking of you, Dorah, there, working with local government, C40 mobilising the world's mayors to take action where national governments are failing. I'm involved with something called the Mayors Migration Council, which is New York-based. We have the mayors from Freetown, Kampala, Amman, Montreal, Austin, Texas, Chicago is just going to join now as well, looking at climate displacement. So there's lots of energy building up to the next COP process. What would you like to see happen over the next 10 months? And what would you like to happen at COP to take into account the challenges that you've been raising around that relationship between colonialism, racism, climate change that could unlock meaningful change? If I start with you, Wawa.
Earlier on, there was a mention of how, the blame game or pointing fingers isn't helpful. I think it's so necessary in any climate conversation. I mean, it is the so-called global north. It is the United States, the UK, France. These countries who have quite literally led us into this circumstance, who built their wealth through the Industrial Revolution, through the extraction of labor from racialized people, through chattel slavery, that have allowed them to become the Goliaths that they are today. And I think the fossil fuel industry has to be held accountable. I mean, one of the big critiques of activists and folks that are involved in COP processes is the fact that the fossil fuel industry is a major representation of those spaces. They have I believe in the past years, the lobbyist numbers have increased to the hundreds. Over 500 fossil fuel lobbyists were at COP last year. That's like one out of, I don't know, there's too many of them, to be honest. Especially if the conversation that they don't want to have is about redistribution of their wealth, right? And that is a conversation that we need to have more, which is reparations. There is historical harm that unfortunately can never be undone necessarily, but it can be rectified to a degree by supporting, emerging economies around the world in their just transition. Where is that money going to come from? Being in the climate space, running a nonprofit, I spend most of my time thinking about money and talking about money because there's not enough of it. Climate is the least funded social issue out there. It's already a scarcity game. In the US, the majority of the funding that goes into the environmental space goes to big green organizations. And there are even questions about what the program focuses of those organizations are, right? And whether or not it's being eventually led to the communities that really need this type of investment. But where is the money going to come from when it comes to this just transition? It has to come from the fossil fuel industry. It has to come from countries like the United States. And it's important for us to note, in 2023, then climate envoy John Kerry said very distinctly in Congress that the US would, quote, under no circumstances pay climate reparations to developing countries who are experiencing fossil fuel-driven climate disaster. That is a huge problem.
Is even less about nations and about individuals. Like, there should be no billionaires. And I think that shouldn't be a radical statement. And I think that, like, the higher level of taxes that even go into, like, the US, we should also think about redistributing that in a UBI or some other system like that. Because also it's usually those individuals who have, like, majority climate emissions, like, you shouldn't be able to take a private jet somewhere because that in itself, as an individual, you are putting so many carbon emissions in that act, right? And I think that is not that's the uncomfortable answer that people don't really want to hear. But I think it's an important answer. And I think also if we allow for an economic system that has a few people donating to causes they deem fit, we have this lack of funding. People don't want to engage in a climate space. They don't have to. Their money doesn't have to go towards that. And I think that also doesn't allow for a democratic use of resources. So that is, I think we have to question why we have billionaires still, especially in the current context.
I also just want to throw out a statistic that I recently read, which blew my mind. In 2022, the 6 richest fossil fuel companies made enough profit in the first 6 months of that year to pay for all of the loss and damage demands of the entire global south for 6 months. So there is money, that capital exists, but that capital is being used for the most short-term greed.
Paul.
Yeah, I mean, I think the key for me in thinking about this from the perspective of where I work, right, is creating a space where these convenings can move outside the orbit of specialized voices. I'm putting that in quotes. I think it is, for any of these conversations to happen, we need to bridge the gap between everyday people's lives and representatives who are attending, right, these large climate conversations, right? And I think that's where it was, I think, Marvin, your work is brilliant, because that's where what I see is kind of happening with some of the examples that were provided earlier. The value for me, of thinking about things like reparations, climate reparations, is expanding our conception of what that means, right? Quite literally. That it is not a simple zero-sum game of money transitioning. It's a mindset about what is valued, what is wealth, and how can we acknowledge and make good on our responsibility, right? Our collective responsibility to our planet and to the people who are being affected. I mean, this is the kind of work that I really feel like it takes shape in policy. And I don't make policy, but I do think there's this deep need to kind of get people into a framework of this sense of change that is not zero sum, that is not purely about, like, what am I losing, right? And what is somebody, and who is gaining something that they don't deserve. I think these are the kinds of things. The only way we're going to begin to do that is by listening to the voices of people who are affected. We're engaged in work with this project that I'm involved in called In Slavery's Wake: Making Black Freedom in the World. It's an exhibition. A part of this is a set of community conversations called Unfinished Conversations. And to, I think, both your earlier point about, like, what is the value of remembering, and to this question about what do you recommend we do now, is programs like this really valorize listening to people, going to communities who are affected, whether they're in San Luis, Senegal, or outside of Mobile, Alabama, to ask people who are directly in the path of this history, what do they see as their connections to the history? What are the problems? What are their visions for the future? Not saying that they may necessarily have the policy like ready to go, but they're who policymakers need to listen to more and more, and who too often are the most ignored.
Thank you. And we're going to come to you now, but that final what over the next 9-10 months in lead up to COP goes to you, Dorah.
So for me, COP30, it's a very pivotal summit. I reflect back in terms of the Earth Summit 1992 in Brazil. Now we are going to Belém, and I think there is a real opportunity for the world to reignite this multilateral process, which is slowly losing credibility. Again, a lot of work needs to be done at home. We all need to put in the work. We are going to go into COP30 in Brazil with national efforts in terms of our adaptation plans, in terms of our nationally determined contributions. And I think if we wait to get, if we wait for COP30 in Belém without doing the hard work in this month, in the lead up to COP30, we will come back from COP30 with a mediocre, outcome. We have to be ambitious. All of us need to put in the hard work in our own countries to make sure that we are really invigorating the efforts in each of our own countries in terms of what is it that we would like to achieve from an adaptation point of view. Also, in terms of the contribution to reduce our own carbon emissions, what are our ambitions in terms of doing that? And once we've done that, when we get to Brazil, then it will all happen, because I think we lose the battles in our own countries and really just look at what then gets negotiated at the summit. I think it is a bottom-up approach. We cannot leave this process to governments to make their own decisions. Various groups, various institutions in our own countries, we really need to be very clear in terms of what is the ask or the demands that we're placing in our own countries as they prepare to go to Belém, because that will determine whether this multilateral process that we so need to be able to deal with this climate emergency stays credible or not. Because we have seen that the past 2-3 COPs have really resulted in a lot of lethargy, where those that have been looking at it have felt that we are not going to be able to get anything, and why don't we look at alternative process? Unfortunately, one country alone can never be able to solve this problem, because climate change knows no boundaries. It knows difference between developed or developing countries. It affects us. It affects all of us. Unfortunately, those with little resources or those that are vulnerable are going to feel it the most. And it is important for us to be able to do that. And I think if we go there with the quest to build solidarity, to be able to hold each other accountable, and with transparency, and realizing the fact that we are not all starting at an equal footing. All of us have got responsibility, but it is differentiated in terms of our historical responsibilities. And I think we need to really recall this, because the multilateral climate regime, it's very vulnerable at the moment. And we are hoping that the activism that is known to exist in Brazil will be able to help us to invigorate this very important multilateral process.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm warned about time, so we can pick up outside of here. I'm going to come back to the panel. Final comments for you to sign off today. In order, I'm going to start with you, Wawa.
Okay. Final comments. I think I need a little bit of time, so I'm going to pop it over to Dorah, actually.
Dorah? What would you... is that a phrase? Oh, no. What would you leave us with as a final concise comment?
I want to just to say to all of us, I think the panel and also everyone in the room, that it is important for us to realize that we cannot solve the problem of climate emergency or even climate breakdown, I think right now we call it, with the same mentality, the same structures, systems, and institutions that created it in the first place. So we must reimagine, the models, the strategies, and institutions and policies that are needed to be able to curb this climate breakdown. So we need bold and courageous leadership to be able to go to COP30 and literally deliver on the finance that is needed, deliver on the carbon reductions that are required. Because I don't think we need any evidence to know that this is really, really very urgent. I just want to end with the words of one great African, Thomas Sankara. He says, you cannot carry out fundamental change without a certain amount of madness. In this case, it comes from non-conformity. The courage to turn your back on the old formulas, the courage to invent the future, and because it took the madmen of yesterday for us to be able to act with extreme clarity today. So he says, I want to be one of those madmen. We must dare to invent the future today. We have an opportunity, we have platforms, we have resources, we have some knowledge and the science that is required for us to be able to do this. And this is the time for us to do it.
Thank you. Paul.
Even with breaking up, how am I supposed to follow that? I think that I think I want to lift up what you said at the very beginning, which is this sense of that we are in a crisis, but it's been a rolling crisis. That is metastasizing over time throughout history. How do we narrate a story of historical catastrophe? I think we do it by listening to those people, as you suggested, who've been experiencing and navigating what I'll call the wake of this catastrophe for hundreds of years, who are providing and have provided other models, so that you kind of referenced very quickly, of engaging with our world and engaging with each other as human beings, that we need to look to and embrace and incorporate. And I don't think what I'm talking about is sort of this idea of white folks created a problem, black folks need to solve it, right? That is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about power, empowerment on the terms that you're raising, right? That you're talking about in the conversations you're having. This is something that we need to find. This is a history and a crisis we need to find common ground around.
Thank you, Paul. And Tori, final comments.
Yeah, I actually pose something more to the audience. And I think it's a question about how you live, right? So is the thing that you're consuming actually bringing you happiness? And what are the moments that you feel the most connected to the people around you? I think those are the moments where we actually can start having dialogue of change. And I think that honestly doesn't look like always doing the next biggest thing, or I think it's about slowing down. And I question you all to think about how in your own life you can slow down and really engage with the space around you and build your communities, your cities, to look like a slower way of living.
your final comment now.
I was trying to think of a specific resource I could offer. I was trying to think of a specific resource I could offer, but I think based off of what you both said, there's a really, really powerful essay. Could you press on the button? There's a very powerful essay by a good friend of mine who's a climate justice essayist. Her name is Mary Annalise Hegler, and it's titled "Climate Change Ain't the First Existential Threat," which really speaks to the fact that people have had to fight for their lives before. There are many people that have seen the end of their worlds time and time again, and those folks have so much to offer when it comes to betting on a future that isn't promised. So I'd recommend that folks go read that. And the second thing that I would say is I think we need to be very specific with our language when we talk about climate change. And it goes back to accountability. I think if we are going to have any conversation about climate change moving forward, we should use language like climate crisis to really embody the scale and scope. And we have to talk about the folks and the institutions, and yes, the individuals, CEOs of fossil fuel companies who have known about the climate crisis since the 1950s and continue to perpetuate those systems. It is important to call those institutions and individuals out, because that is how we're going to start solving this crisis.
Yeah, thank you. So thank you to the panel. Thank you for being here this evening.